Welcome to the Oracle class, yet even more stories from the secret city. This is October the 2nd, 2023. And let's see if I can share my screen. And got it up now. I'll remind you, if you will, mute your microphone and keep it muted until you're speaking to the group. Now, as always, we welcome you to speak up anytime you will. But if you'll keep it muted, then we won't have any background noise. Use the speaker view if you want to see a large image of the person speaking. And remember, you can drag that view over to get it larger if you need it. Use the gallery view to see all participants. And then, as I mentioned, you can spread that over if you want to. Use chat to enter questions, either to me privately or to everybody, and I'll try to watch it. But the best alternate method is just unmute your microphone and ask your questions directly. We don't mind being interrupted at all. But if I see you're just sitting there and not muted, I'm going to mute you, okay? I won't mute Mark. I want him to stay on. Now, let's see where we are, right here. Now, remember, I've been telling you that this is what we're doing for the 3 sessions. We're on the second one, Murder Will Out, with Mark Griffith. And then, depending on the time allowed, I want him to take all the time he needs. Then I'll show you the part 2 of the history of Robertsville, either today or next week, depending on which what our time allowance is. I want to encourage you to see the Oppenheimer movie. I'm still not going to show that trailer. I would just want you to watch the movie. And I want to tell you that Mark is going to talk about his story about a murder that happened in very near where Robertsville was. And he's got it out online for you to get it if you would like to. And I'll if I can get this thing to work for me, I'll put that in the chat so that anyone who wants to get it can. And Mark, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and let you share your screen.
I'll do that. And just let everybody know that if you can't download that PDF book version, you can send Ray an email and I'll be happy to email directly the PDF version that I have. So you see my screen now, Ray?
Yes, we see it now.
Okay. So thank you for letting me come and join you all. It looks like a great bunch. And this is always a interesting topic to me. And just to give you a little bit of background, I married an Oak Ridge girl, so that's my official connection to Oak Ridge. And her father was an original Manhattan Project Army Corps of Engineers person that came in right at the start of Manhattan Project. So I have a connection there, and he shared a lot of stories about early Oak Ridge, and it's just a fascinating place. So
Mark,
I have Mark, yeah, go ahead.
Would you mind to put your camera on so people can see who's speaking to them?
Yeah, my camera failed me.
Okay.
We're talking about.
That's fine then. Just go right ahead.
And so my company sends these cameras, you plug on the top of it, and it will not work. So I don't know.
Don't worry
apologize.
About it. No, it's okay. It's okay. We'll be fine.
But actually, it's probably easier on their eyes without having to look at me the entire time.
Okay.
So my company put me onto writing some blogs and things for our company website for Oak Ridge history, because I have an office out here in Oak Ridge and have had an office since 1994. I've worked professionally out here in the mortgage loan business since 1983. So I have a history here. I love Oak Ridge. I'm not going to leave Oak Ridge. And like I said, I married an Oak Ridge girl. So I started writing these blogs. And just interesting piece, I was doing a blog about the Oak Ridge Pool. and I was just doing the history of the pool and the great oral histories that were done by Ray and Keith McDaniels in the library of Oak Ridge. It was just a rich source of history for me. And so I was going in there searching the transcripts of these interviews that Keith McDaniels did of some of the original Oak Ridgers and engineers and scientists. And I was putting in word search pool because I was doing the history of the pool, and I was just doing the simple word search POOL. And when I hit it, I would pick up conversations that revolve around pool. Well, came across this one, and I was reading the oral history transcripts, and this gentleman was wanting to talk about a murder that happened near the pool, and Keith McDaniels was trying to keep him on track of the history of the Oak Ridge lab. And so he goes, "Can I talk about the pool now? Well, let's talk about this first." And then you talk a little bit about that. And then he would go in and say, "Can I talk now about that murder at the pool?" So it was one of those things that just kept on going. And finally, Keith came to the end and said, "Okay, now you can talk about it." And so he started sharing the history of this murder, but all the facts were distorted. And he had the correct part that there was a murder, but how it transformed, what was involved, who was involved, all of this was just, lost from time. So somehow the continuity of time was disrupted in this area of Robertsville. And I credit that to the Secret City coming in and removing some of that history. When you remove a city, like Robertsville and Wheat Community and Scarborough, and you move the people and transport them out, you lose the context of history. Wouldn't you agree, Ray?
I would, absolutely. That's what happened.
That's what happens. And that's what's so perfect and wonderful about Ray coming in as a historian and pulling some of this history back. Now, we have some of the original Oak Ridgers that we can tap and have tapped to bring some of that history back to us. But this story, as you can see on my screen, is Murder Will Out. That's what I call it. I didn't make up that. I got a lot of criticism about that title, Ray.
Yeah, I know. I was one that asked you about it.
Oh, well, did you? But a lot of folks were saying, "Well, isn't that Agatha Christie? Hadn't she worn out the murder will, murder she said, murder, that and the other thing?" But I just could not get away from the fact that this murder will out is a quote from the governor of the state of Tennessee and in 1922, because on the eve of the execution of these four men, and he used the last term he used in his press release for justifying the fact that he was not going to stay the execution sentence. His last words were "murder will out." And because that was in the press release, I had to jump all over that. I had to use that. And that's a Chaucer, going back to Chaucer used that term in the Canterbury Tales. So it was a perfect one. It was used. It's an old historic phrase. But anyway, that's what this is. Let me show you a better picture of these gentlemen. If I can bring this over, can you all see that?
Yes, we have it.
See that?
Yes, got it. Full screen.
Okay, full screen. These four young men, all in their 20s, 1921. To the left is that little guy, is Charles Petrie. Next to him is John McClure. Charles Petrie is from, he has connections to Robertsville. He grew up as a child in Robertsville. There's a farm somewhere. My wife is an expert research person, DNA and research. She helped me with this case immensely. We were not able to track down his family effectively, convincingly, except that in the court transcripts, it says Charles and witnesses say that they knew him from the Robertsville area. So he has a connection to Robertsville, and that's why this murder occurred in Robertsville. Next to him was John McClure, who does not have any connection that I could find to Tennessee. He's from Boston. I did find his home, his childhood home in Boston, but he came from Boston and probably met these guys during World War I. All of these guys had some tie to World War I. These are post World War I times from the end of the war of 1918. Next to him is Otto Stevens. Otto Stevens with his hat and a smile. I find that interesting that these guys were arrested at this time. They're standing in front of the Knoxville jail in downtown Knoxville at the courthouse, behind the courthouse. That's Otto Stevens. He's from Oakdale. Everybody's probably very familiar with the Oakdale, Harriman area. So Otto Stevens definitely has a connection to this area, grew up in this area. As to the man, lastly, Tom Christmas. You probably recognize the Christmas name. I could not find any connection to Christmas lumber and this particular Tom Christmas. So just to put that out there, I don't know that they're related. If they are, it's extremely remote. So, but I could be wrong, but we searched that. Tom Christmas is from Harriman. His mother was in Harriman at the time, and that was his connection. Otto Stevens, Tom Christmas knew this area. What happened here is about a bank robbery. The bank robbery was to occur in Oakdale, Tennessee, at the Bank and Trust. There was only one bank down there in 1921 at that time. Oakdale was a pretty powerful hub of railroad community. It was a central hub. A lot of connector trains would move out of there at that particular time. It's a fairly large city at that time. So it had a bank. I did find some records of the banks and of their liabilities, profit and loss statements for the banks. Interesting enough, they were online. I did find them, and they would have, fairly large sum on payroll days. Upwards of $100,000 at any particular time. So these Otto Stevens, I would think, since he grew up in Oakdale, probably hatched the plan with these other compatriots here of targeting Oakdale to be robbed. And so they had to figure out how they were going to do that. So they all got together and they strategized. In the court records that occurred, the hearings, the trial was located in Clinton. Those records were destroyed through deterioration of the courthouse. I think the ceiling fell in, rainwater destroyed, and they had to destroy all the evidence. Most of this that I found was located in the Supreme Court hearings that where the appeals of these four men to the Supreme Court, that it detailed what occurred. So all of these records were there, plus the victim, the surviving victim named Andrew Crumley, he testified to it, plus was constantly giving interviews to newspapers in Knoxville, Clinton newspaper, Roane County newspaper. So anybody that would talk to him he would be more than happy to speak to. But this is what happened. Then in May 30th, 1921, these four men hatched a plan that they were going to go to Knoxville at the Southern Railroad Depot in Knoxville on Depot Street. Is everybody familiar with that location?
Yes.
Yes, got it.
Yeah. So that depot was a central hub for the railroad station, and right outside, and it's still there today. And I might have a picture of it if I can pull it up here. I just found this photo today. Can you all see that?
Yes, got it.
That's an old one in the early 1900s, and you see that bridge that goes out to Depot Street.
Yeah.
This one, you see that taxi stand right there.
Yes, I got it.
So that taxi stand was in place in 1921, and they hatched this plan that they were going to go over and steal this this information. They were going to go to, they sent Charles Petrie and John McClure. This Charles Petrie and John McClure were going to go to Knoxville to the Southern Railroad Depot station and wait for a specific vehicle to come to the stand where they can hire the taxi. And it was the reason they were waiting and being very choosing of their vehicle that they were going to hire to take them to do this crime was because they knew that they were going to have to escape on bad roads in 1921. As you know, this was the beginning times of the good roads movement. It was well entrenched. Knoxville was just now getting pretty good paved roads within the city of Knoxville. Some cities were getting better paved roads, but the county roads were deplorable and very difficult to travel and dark. So they knew that if they were going to commit a robbery, they're going to have a pretty good car to get them across these roads so they can make their escape. So they sat and waited for the particular car to come across the taxi stand before they were going to jump on it and hire that taxi. So what they did is they waited for what was called a Chandler 6. Chandler was a touring sedan of the time, 1921, very popular car because it was 6-cylinder when all the other cars were just 4 cylinders. Thicker tires, meant to travel on rough roads, heavy 6-cylinder that could pull them out of mud and all. They could, and fast. They figured they could hire this one and get away with their crime. So Charles and John stood down there, waited for a taxi to come up. Andrew Crumley was the taxi driver at that time. He was a 23-year-old that lived right around the corner on State Street and Cumberland Avenue. There's a boarding house there. He pulled up with this Chandler 6. These guys said, "Hey, we'd like to hire you." I said, "Fine, jump on in." They jumped into the back seat. He said, "Where would you like to go?" And Charles Petrie said, "Well, we'd like to go to Clinton. And then after that, 6 or 7 miles out in the country." So Andrew started off onto his drive and he said, 6 or 7 miles out in the country. Where were you wanting to go specifically? And they said, "Well, just 6 or 7 miles out in the country." Well, this sent a big red flag to Andrew Crumley. And he started questioning. Now, something was going on in 1921 at this particular time. Can anybody think of what was happening nationally in 1921 that would have been a big social push? Women loved it, men hated it. Anybody want to jump in and take a guess? This is pop quiz for the morning.
I don't have a clue.
Prohibition.
Ah, okay.
Prohibition was a year in at this particular time.
All right.
And so Andrew was saying, "Hey, look now, boys, if you're thinking about me taking you out 6 or 7 miles in the country on a still run, you've mistaken. I won't have no part of that illegal activity." This is what he testified in court. "Don't want anything to do with it." They realized that they probably weren't specific enough. And they said, no, so talked them down off that fear. Still, Andrew Crumley, being young and fairly intelligent, knew something was up, didn't feel totally comfortable, but he knew that this was 6:20 at night that this taxi was hired. So this is a nighttime already. And they knew going to Clinton and then 6 or 7 more miles in the country, he'd be returning to Knoxville in the dark. So he said, "Well, is it all right now if I just turn the corner here and go to my place where I'm boarding and pick up a friend of mine who will travel with me so he can help me spot these roads at night?" They said, "Sure, that's fine." So they turned the corner, went down to State Street and Cumberland to a boarding house, which, Ray, I think was possibly the boarding house that may have been the Capitol at one time. There was a Capitol down there on the State Street, I discovered, and it was turned subsequently into a boarding house and eventually torn down.
Okay.
So it was a big 2-story thing with a lot of porches. He went up there, stopped. There's several people sitting on the porch. He went up to his friend, talking out loud that, hey, look, I've got these 2 guys who wants to go to Clinton, and would you drive with me because the roads are dark at night and blah blah blah. The guy told him, yes, I'll come. But a fellow overheard this by the name of George Lewis. He was a 45-year-old widow man that lived there. His family lived in Clinton. So he said, hey, look, I overheard this conversation. I was wondering if you let me come with you. My daughter lives there, and my grandson and my son-in-law lives just right in Clinton. I could just go in for the ride, help you, and when you drop them off, come back through Clinton, pick me up, and bring me home. So that was agreed upon. George Lewis, Andrew Crumley got in the car. Charles Petrie, John McClure were in the back. They started off for Clinton probably around 7:15 or something like that in the evening. And I don't know if you all are familiar with those roads going out Clinton, but I've followed all of that and tracked all of that down. There are some still original parts of the road that they would have traveled. Old Clinton Pike. Anybody familiar with Old Clinton Pike? It's out there by Emory Road, just off Emory Road near Powell area, which would have been the original Powell station going out. So they would have traveled some of these roads. They would have left Knoxville, gone down Broadway, gone down Central Avenue, and then they would have turned to Emory Road. They would have gone down Emory Road, and they would have hit this Old Clinton Pike. So it was called Clinton Pike at the time. Route 9 later, Highway 25, what you all are familiar with today, Clinton Highway. Heading out toward Clinton, this would have been Rocky Road once they got past some of these concrete. Now, some of those roads in Clinton were concreted, beautiful roads, and still paved today. The Old Clinton Pike is still that original concrete path. So it's pretty in good shape. However, they went on out and drove to Clinton and went across the Old Clinton Bridge. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the new bridge where it's located. Down the road past that is the Old Clinton Bridge that would have come out at the Farmers Co-op there in Clinton, if you're familiar with that. That was where the Magnet Mill was, and really the bridge came out there. They would have come right into downtown Clinton and they stopped at a boarding house right near the depot in Central. Stopped at that. That was the first place that they wanted to stop. John McClure popped out of the cab, went up onto the front porch. There was 2 men sitting there, Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas. He looked over to him. Several people were sitting on that front porch. This is, of course, in May, so it was pretty, and said, gentlemen, can I speak to you for a moment? They went inside, had their conversation, and Otto Stevens, Tom Christmas came out with 2 bags of their belongings, headed to the car. Andrew Crumley steps out of the taxi, Chandler 6, and says, hey, now, what do you all got into that bags that you want to go 6 or 7 miles out into the country? Or these aren't burglary tools, are they? He starts getting upset. He thinks something's going on. Reiterates to them, you know, it's illegal to go to a moonshine. You can't do this. They all calmed him down and said, no, you're fine. We're just going to go out, 6 or 7 miles. And I don't know what they told him. He never really testified specifically where that 6 and 7 miles was going to take him, but they were going to go down toward Robertsville 6 or 7 miles. George Lewis was still in the car. He should have gotten out because the whole plan was for him to go visit his daughter that was right around the corner. I found their house originally about a block and a half from where they would have stopped. He should have gotten out there. But George Lewis knew something was wrong. Andrew Crumley felt something was wrong. Yet they still continued to take these men on to Robertsville. Got in the car. They left Clinton about 8:20, started heading down State Highway 61, which was the old state highway going toward, which was called Oliver Springs Pike. So at that particular time, the roads, wherever they were going to a major city, was called that road, like Oliver Springs Pike. If it was coming back to Clinton, they called it Clinton Pike. So it's kind of misleading when you look at history. Sometimes the roads is one road that may have two separate names depending on the location that you're traveling. Kind of interesting. But they were heading toward present day Oak Ridge, Robertsville, and they started heading down. Charles Petrie was in the back. All of them were sitting in the back. George Lewis up front, Andrew Crumley up front. They got about 6 or 7 miles into Robertsville. It's getting late, probably about 9 o'clock. And Charles Petrie starts sticking his head out the window and said, "Stop the car." He gets out and he looks back. "No, this isn't it," he says. Jumps back in. He says, "Continue on," to giving Andrew Crumley the directions. Andrew's still feeling like something's going wrong. They continue on another couple of miles. He said, "Stop the car." Jumps out again, looks around at his surroundings, said, "No, this isn't it. Go on." A little bit further down, he goes, "Stop." Jumps out of the car. He said, "This is it. This is it." Where they stopped is right where South Illinois is. They pass the Robertsville Crossroads. You all know where Robertsville Crossroads, you're probably going to talk that history, right?
Yeah.
But
it's right there by the pool.
right there by the pool. And so they, the Crossroads were right there. Lockett's store was there,
yeah,
on the corner, which was Kim's Son restaurant for a long time. Sadly, that's gotten torn down
yeah,
here recently. Next to that was John Key's store. And John Key was a central figure in Robertsville. You're probably going to cover John Key, aren't you, Ray?
mention him, yes.
He was a central figure and central figure to this story. So they continued up State Highway 61, that old road going up, which we call South Illinois Avenue now. But it was a lot more windier and headed toward Topside or Hillside. What is it called up there? Is it Hillside or Topside?
Hillside.
Hillside. Yeah, Hillside Market up there. You know those apartment complexes that are there on the left as you're going up on Hillside.
Yeah.
Behind that was the location.
Called it Hilltop.
Hilltop.
Yeah.
Right there was the apartment complexes is kind of where they were. When they came up South Illinois, which is today, they would have been right there at Iroquois Avenue and gone behind the apartments. There was a windy road. South Illinois to Hilltop is now straightened out, and that happened during for the Manhattan Project. They straightened out that stretch. Anyway, that's where this was located. They were at a chert pit that was located right there behind those apartment complex. And a chert pit is nothing but a gravel pit that they used to dig out and gravel the road to make it more of an all-weather road in certain areas. There's these pits all over the place that they would dig and try to repair the roads that they use. But this one was located right there. No doubt, Charles Petrie played in this pit area when he was a child. He knew this pit. He's the one that found the pit for them that night when they drove up in that Chandler. So they got there and they told the men to get out. And so stop the car, get out. Andrew Crumley got out and George Lewis got out. And then there was a little moments of silence, and then they heard, "Stick up your hands, put your hands up." And so Andrew Crumley and George Lewis immediately put their hands over their heads. And Andrew Crumley said, I knew it. He thought the sheriff had the drop on him. He said, "No, I'm Andrew Crumley. I'm a taxi cab driver. These men hired me, and I know that they're up to no good. And I knew that they were coming for an illegal moonshine. I have nothing to do with this. This is my friend George Lewis. He has nothing to do with it. We're just out for the ride." Pleaded his case in the dark without looking over their shoulder. Silence. Nothing. Finally, one of the guys said, just keep walking, start walking. Then they realized that there was no sheriff, that the drop on him was John McClure. Voice behind him had a 45 revolver stuck in their back. They got them to a little ways, put their hands behind their back and bound them up with some cord, tied it real tight, and started walking them into the pit area, which was a little ways off the road. And Andrew Crumley was pleading for his life at this point. Listen, guys, I've got a family. I've got a young child. You can't do anything. And they assured him nothing was going to happen to you. We're not planning on hurting anybody. We just want your vehicle. Well, you can have it. You take the keys. You just whatever. You go, well, we're just going to tie you up to a tree and we're going to take off and we're going to leave. So they were feeling okay. As they were walking into this pit area, they didn't think anything was really going to bad happen to them because these guys, 4 guys, had joked with them, talked with them all the way from Knoxville. They thought everything was going to be fine, but things started to develop. As they got to the pit, they were started going through their pockets. Went through Andrew Crumley's pockets, and they found a New Testament Bible, his discharge papers from World War I, some other type of documents, his badge from the taxi cab, those types of items. And went through George Lewis' pockets, and Charles Petrie was the one going through, the little guy over here from Tennessee, going through his pockets. And he pulls out a magazine. And this is where the story starts to unravel for George Lewis and Andrew Crumley. As innocent as a magazine, it's dark. He's got his flashlight. He gets it's called a Police Gazette magazine. I don't know if you're ever familiar with these. This is 1920s police, but at the front cover of these things were equivalent to Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. They were a little bit risque on the front cover, and just to sell magazines. The stories inside the magazines were police stories. It was called Police Gazette, but the front was obviously intended to bring some zest to the magazine sales. And so Charles Petrie put his flashlight on this magazine and saw the front cover, and he made the quip. And this is what was on the records in the Supreme Court hearings and in all the papers, according to Andrew Crumley, about George Lewis. Charles Petrie looked at the magazine cover with the flashlight and said, "Why, you are a sport," to that effect. Happy with his little quip of that little dig to George Lewis, he kind of started smiling, took that flashlight and ratcheted it up to George Lewis's face to see if he thought it was as humorous remark as he thought it was. Saw his face and stopped, looked at him, and his smile just kind of slipped away. Andrew knew something was wrong. And he said, "I do believe I know you," Charles Petrie said to George Lewis. And George looked back at him, paused for a moment, and said, "I do believe I know you too." That doomed it. They were ID'd at that point. The other 3 heard this exchange. Andrew Crumley noticed that they all looked at each other and started walking off, motioning to each other to move away from the group that was bound up. Ordered Charles Lewis to gag both of them as they were doing this. They walked off and they started talking. John McClure came back to help Petrie gag both of them. And as they were gagging them, John McClure heard and testified and told several people, including the arresting officer at the time, he heard what was the discussion was going on between Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas was dead men tell no tales. So that was the plan. It switched from a simple carjacking, car heist. It was going to turn into something much worse. So they all decided that these men were going to have to die. They didn't want to fire their gun. They did have a gun, but in that area, if they fired a gun, that was just going to alert every community, everybody living in that area. It was at 9:20 at night. It was going to alert somebody. Somebody was going to make a phone call. Somebody had a phone. It was 1921. There were phones there. Not everybody had one, but they knew it was going to alert something. So they had to do something else to silence these guys. So somebody slipped up behind George Lewis, and hit him 4 blows with something heavy. Hit him hard. Maybe it was a rock, but crushed him bad. He fell down withering in pain, knocked out unconscious for a little bit. Andrew Lewis got hit as well in the head. He doesn't remember how many times he got hit, but I'm sure it was several times. He got knocked down. All he heard was swishing in his head, and he was in bad trouble. He fell down too. As they were thinking about this, they were moving around, and he heard them talking. Are they dead? Are they dead? Andrew Crumbley decided he better play dead because they know that this was in it for real. So he feigned death. This is what he tells everybody, all the reporters going in the courts. He played dead. He acted as those struck in the head killed him. So he did everything in his power not to move. Conversely, George Lewis was writhing in pain. The guys knew that they had to do something to finish him off. They had a penknife with them, so they went over and said, "You're going to have to cut his throat. You're going to have to cut their throats." Andrew Crumbley did not see who was doing this. He was playing dead, but George Lewis was laying right next to him, and then he heard the horrible effect of the cut being occurred against the flesh. He heard the tearing of his jugular, his neck area. Then they said, you got to do it to him too, talking about Andrew Crumbley. So they went over, and he had to play dead. Can you imagine just laying there and letting somebody do that to you? Took a knife and cut his throat as well. He couldn't winch. He couldn't gag. He couldn't do anything. He had to still maintain this death play, and he did it. So after they cut him, they just laid there. They said, "Okay, I think that did it." They wiped off their blade and started walking out. Well, George Lewis was still writhing, and he came through again and started jerking. Obviously, he was in the throes of death. He jerked and kicked and was groaning, and he can heard Andrew Crumbley heard the men out there said, "They're not dead. Go back there and complete the job." So somebody came back in with their knife, sat down on close to George Lewis, and took that knife for a double cut and hit him again. And this time they cut him very deeply. Andrew Crumbley testified of hearing the ghastly sounds of that slice. When they said, "Do the other guy," speaking about Andrew Crumbley, said, "Nah, no point. He's dead." So Andrew had blood everywhere, but had fainted the job, and so they thought he was dead as well. The guys said, "Okay, well, let's get out of here." So they started walking out of the pit. They were heading back to the Chandler 6. Andrew Crumbley realized, was hoping that these guys were leaving. He was terrified. He was panicked. You can just imagine what's going through his mind. And he heard the twig snap, and their voice started to fade as they were heading back to the car. He knew immediately he had to get up. He was still feeling like he could get up and escape. He knew he had to get out of there, but he first had to help George. He got up onto his hands are tied behind the back. He got onto his knees, and he noticed George still groaning and bleeding. And he saw his neck was grotesquely hinged open. So he struggled up and kind of crawled next to him, trying to help put his head, close the gaping wound. So it tried to save him in some way. As he was doing this, he heard the distinct choking sounds and death rattle, as he described it in the court. And George expired right there in front of him. This panicked Andrew Crumley. He just was out of his mind in fear. He got up. Remember, he had a gag across his mouth, and he was hands tied behind his back. He knew he had to run and get out. He was thinking at this point, the guys haven't completed the task. He was still alive, that they were going to come back. So in his mind, he's thinking, these guys are coming back. I got to get out of here. He turned and started to run. And a couple of feet as he ran, he hit a barbed wire fence and flipped over it. Can you imagine the excruciating pain of hitting a barbed wire fence in full run? Flipped over it, got back up, started walking out of that pit area when he heard that Chandler 6 fire up, probably parked down there near Iroquois Road. So not far from where he was on the top side of Robertsville. Heard that Chandler 6 fired up, and it scared him again. He turned back around the way he came and started running and hit that barbed wire fence again and flipped over the other side. So you can imagine the brutality that this poor man was going through, out of his mind, trying to get out. Then he realized, writhing in his own pain, in his own agony, he heard that Chandler go up the hill toward Oliver Springs. So he heard that Chandler 6 engine fade away. He knew he was by himself. So this is about 9:20, 9:30 in the afternoon or in the evening. He knew he had to make it to a farmhouse to get help. He started out looking for homes. He ran across a couple. First one he came across, he banged on the door, kicked the door, screaming murder, trying to help me, you know, and somebody came to the door, didn't open it, and said, what's going on? And he went through the whole thing, what had happened to him. They would not open the door. It would, you know, this is, rural community at night. You don't know what's on the other side. Probably didn't have I don't know why they didn't open the door. They're terrified, I guess, and didn't want to render aid. He went to several farmhouses in that area only to run into the same type of issue. So he was walking around for quite a while in that Black Oak Ridge area. Finally, he saw a light that he thought at first was that Chandler 6 coming back toward him. His panic was still mine that these guys are trying to try to kill me. But it was a light from a porch. So he started walking toward the light, and then he decided it was the school. It was the Robertsville school that's still today. I think, Ray, the old gym is the original part of the school. And
that's correct.
Okay. So that's where he went to, and he sat down on that porch for a while. When he got there, he thought it was a house, but it turned out to be just, unfortunately, a school that was closed. So he sat there while trying to contemplate what to do. He continued to walk. He walked around, heading down what we would call now Robertsville Road, and then he came to Robertsville Baptist Church. And that's still there today too, isn't it?
It right? Is, yes.
And so he was walking around this whole area, and he walked from 9:20 to about 2:20 in the morning. So that's a fairly long time, with a gaping wound in his neck. In the process of this walking, his mouth gagged. He was able to get free from a tree, and it went down and slid over his neck. So it kind of acted as a bandage tourniquet type thing into his gaping neck wound from the cut. So he was able to talk and stop the bleeding somewhat. And he does credit that from being partly the reason he was saved. But the truth of the matter, they used such a small blade to cut, which from a penknife, they would have had to really work on him to cut him deeply like they did George Lewis. But he finally made his way to the crossroads, back to the crossroads, and to a store and house, because John Keyes lived right next to his store. So he made his way to John Key's home and pounded on the door. John Key immediately came to the door, opened up and rendered aid, pulled him inside, saw what had happened, heard what had happened, and immediately sounded out the alarm and started calling the police. The police were on their way. They were going to investigate and figure out what went on that night and try to find George Lewis in the body. In the meantime, our four in the Chandler 6, heading through Oliver Springs, heading toward Harriman, stops at Tom Christmas's mother's house around 2:30 in the morning, about the time that Andrew Crumley finally got some comfort and aid from John Key. And then they got some food and supplies, and they went on to their final destination that evening, which was Oakdale and that bank. So they took the Chandler into Oakdale. It was probably 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. They parked the Chandler up on a hill across the street from the bank. John McClure and Otto Stevens took some of their gear from their sacks that they had packed and went to behind the bank, cracked out a window and jumped in. Their plan was to put on the disguise. Otto put on a little mask over his eyes, one of those blast masks that kids would wear, and a fake mustache, if you can imagine. And it looked like a typical bank robber of the day, you know, things that we see in cartoons. Matter of fact, there was a cartoon depicting this scene that was played out. And hid behind the teller counter with John McClure, who held the gun. Their plan was simple. Sam Oakley, who's the manager of the Oakdale Bank and Trust, was going to come in that morning, and they knew that they were going to jump him early, make him give him the money, go to Chandler and escape. What they didn't realize that the night before was the evening that everyone got their payroll checks from the railroads. So all of the men with their checks were going to be lined out the door before Sam Oakley even got there and waiting to come into the bank and get their money. So unbeknownst to them, there was a crowd of people waiting that morning for Sam Oakley to come open up the door and come in and cash their checks. They would have no idea, since they were hiding behind the counter. They didn't see anybody coming, you know, standing at the door. There was probably 30 or 40 people waiting at the door. Sam Oakley opens the door that 8 o'clock the next morning. They hear it. Otto Stevens, John McClure sitting behind the counter. They hear it. He comes walking in, and they both jump up, said, "Stick your hands up." What's waiting for them is like 30 or 40 of the Oakdale citizens. They have a 6-shooter, and they were staring in the face of 40 people or so. When they did that, now they're masked up. Sam Oakley looks at Otto Stevens and says, "Otto, is that you?" So even the mask, the false mustache and mask did not stop the fact that Otto Stevens is just a homegrown boy, and they recognized him. He knew everybody in town. I don't know why he would think that he'd be able to get away with such a thing, but that's what happened. And so they realized, oh, not only have they been identified, the gig is up. So they jump out the window and they tear out of there. They knew at this time a little girl, they credit a 9-year-old girl, had run out of the bank, sounding the alarm. Banks being robbed, banks being robbed. Citizens were coming out. Now you got to remember, back in 1921, there weren't many bank robberies. The most bank robberies that hit, this is before John Dillinger and, you know, Bonnie and Clyde, all of those people. That's coming later. Everybody was still, you know, Jesse James, the Dalton gang, the younger gangs, those Northfield Bank, which is in the late 1890s. There's not many people that were expecting bank robberies. So they were still in the old time Western town where the citizens came out and they were going to protect their bank. They weren't going to let it be robbed. There wasn't any FDIC coming in with insurance in case of a robbery. It was just a pure loss to the community if somebody, you know, were able to take that money. So they were going to protect it. So they knew it too. And they skedadded. They got up, they ran toward the Chandler Six, got at the top of the hill. By this time, Sam Oakley, leading the charge of 30 or 40 citizens, said, "Get to your cars, boys. We're going to go after these guys." That Chandler Six came roaring down from across the street from the hill and took off. Now, that Chandler Six is going to be no match for the other cars, these little four-cylinder, clucky clucks that were in those cars coming after them. They took off. That's a big car, and you have to be a pretty good driver. But whoever was driving the car was not a very, very good driver, because when they came across the Oakdale Bridge, they wrecked it. And the back end of that Chandler Six slid off. They almost went into Emory River. So, but they still had a pretty significant head start, because the guys, the citizens, were still trying to get their weapons and getting their cars together. Maybe some may have been on horses, but they were still compiling their posse to go after these boys. So they took off running. They went down, all four jumped out of the car and got onto the railroad track line and started running down the railroad tracks to get away. The posse with Sam Oakley were in hot pursuit, but after a while they lost track of them. Sam got smart and said, "Hey, look, let's." They went down the railroad line. Let's get one of these railroad cars, and they got a steam engine somehow. Oakdale's is the hub, like I said. It was easy for them to get a steam engine of some type, and they got on that train and they started going down the line via the locomotive. So they gained a little advantage over these four guys that were on foot. They got down some way and they saw those four guys sitting on the side of the bank of the Emory River, thinking that they're out of danger. And here comes this steam engine with a flat car full of about 30 or 40 guys with guns. They had to skedat. Otto Stevens, Tom Christmas, they're from that area. They knew the backwoods. They took off one direction. John McClure, Boston boy, didn't know anything, followed Charles Petrie, who really didn't know the area as well, separated. They should have stuck with Otto, but they didn't. They immediately got apprehended from the posse. Otto and Tom Christmas were able to make their escape. So Sam took the two captured, John McClure, Charles Petrie, to the Harriman City Jail, where Walter Roberts, who was the sheriff, and he was also the sheriff of Oakdale, and he was the city chief of police of Harriman. So this guy, in my picture, that's the man behind him. You see him. That's Walter Roberts. Pretty tough dude, from what I gathered. Pretty crafty, but not many people realized it at the time, including the governor of the state of Tennessee, Alf Taylor. Because the other two escaped, Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas escaped. Now, this started becoming sensational just in the matter of a few hours, because the telephone, telegraph, whatever. Andrew Crumley was sounding the alarm of this murder. Now, they still had not put together the fact that this Oakdale robbery and this murder were connected. There was nothing there to connect the two, except that they were in search of these two guys. So when Charles Petrie and John McClure got apprehended, Sheriff Roberts realized that there was a murder up on Black Oak Ridge. And he started asking the questions about the murder. And so, no, we just, and then Roberts realized that this was a taxi stolen from Knoxville, and Andrew Crumley was a taxi driver. And then Roberts connected the two. So this was a stolen taxi. They committed the murder, and Roberts came to Oakdale to rob. So quickly, all the citizens sharing information realized what was going on. People became livid. Now, in the history of 1921 in Harriman, Knoxville, there were already race trouble, and things were going to get bad. But what had happened was Roberts said, "We got to move these boys. We got to get them to Knoxville, a bigger, secure, safer place." Took them to Knoxville, and that's where John McClure and Charles Petrie were held. Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas went to Nemo, Tennessee, where they hid out in a cave, and they were aided and comforted by one of friends of Tom Christmas, and probably Lee Christmas, his brother. They held out there for a couple of days and for a couple of weeks, actually. Alf Taylor, governor of Tennessee, this became national headline news. Everybody was covering this story nationally. It became sensational. It was the most horrific murder occurred in East Tennessee in their history. Everybody was about this thing, and pressure was coming on Roberts to solve this murder. Well, he wasn't doing anything. At this time, 300, 400 posse people that were put together by certain organizations were combing the mountains looking for Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas. No luck. Roberts was sitting with his 4 deputies in Harriman, not doing anything. They were getting the wrath of and pressure from Alf Taylor. Roberts knew something. Roberts knew that they were still in the area. Roberts knew that Tom Christmas and Lee Christmas were connected. He knew that they were receiving aid and comfort. And Roberts reached out to Lee. Eventually, these guys got tired of living in a cave up in Nemo, Tennessee, and hatched the plan with Lee. Probably promised something like, "Oh, these boys if they didn't commit the murder, then they're going to be, Tom Christmas is going to be, let go. He'll be fine." So Lee talked those 2 guys coming out of the mountains, driving into the city, and Sheriff Roberts was with his posse of 4 sheriff's deputies with guns waiting for them to come out of the mountains. And on that road, they stood blocking the road with their high-power weapons, stopped Lee Christmas, and arrested Tom and Otto Stevens. So they were apprehended. They immediately took them to Knoxville, where all 4 finally were in the cage together in Knoxville. 1,000 people a day were coming through the Knoxville jail to view this because, like I said, Knoxville papers were going crazy with the story. Clinton papers going crazy with the story. And soon after this, just a few months later, July, they moved these 4 guys to Clinton to have the trial. That became the sensation of the nation. It was incredible circus atmosphere. Hundreds of people would travel from Knoxville to Clinton to see this trial. Rooms were rented out. Every car was rented out. People were coming from all over. You couldn't get tickets. They said Clinton's city doubled in size on the first day of the trial started, which was July 18th, if you can believe that. They had people coming from all over. There was cigarette and cigar sales, girls walking up and down the halls during the trial. The trial would sit about 300 people, 500 people packed into it, trying to get a seat to watch this trial. Clinton said that all the furniture stores in Clinton sold out of chairs. People were buying their own chairs and taking them into the courtroom to sit because there wasn't enough chairs. And after the first day, people were taking their own chairs out with them. They said the reports of people carrying their own chairs out. Somebody reported that they thought the crowd was looting the courthouse. There were so many chairs coming out. So this was just a wild thing. There was people on the streets. There were street vendors. There were street criers. There was poets and all sorts of things going on. It was just a carnival until the day that Andrew Cullman got up onto the trial stand and he made his testimony. Alf Taylor, governor of the state of Tennessee, sent the Attorney General for the state of Tennessee to prosecute this case. This is how serious Alf Taylor was about prosecuting these 4 men. He put a dream team together, which were some notable attorneys from Knoxville, and they prosecuted all 4 of these defendants. Andrew Crumley told the story on that day. It was the first day that there was silence in the courtroom. The judge had a hard time getting control of the courtroom, but finally we're able to get quiet when Andrew Crumley told his story, gasps, crying, when he would tell the story of what happened and what happened to poor George Lewis. Finally, the day came, and jury came back and found all 4 defendants guilty. Court sentenced them electrocution in Nashville, and they were sent to Nashville to be electrocuted. The Attorney General Bertram at that time said in his closing arguments that this murder will be remembered 100 years hence. Didn't happen that way. And I think it's because the case was solved and these men were found guilty. I think that, people start forgetting the story, not like other stories where the cases aren't solved. I think that stays, like Jack the Ripper or something, that people are still trying to solve them. This case was solved. Went down to Nashville. All 4 were incarcerated there in the death chamber. And on March 1st, 1922, it was the day of the execution. Old Smoky was the chair that they used. It was constructed from 1919 gallows they tore down in 1919, and they constructed the electric chair out of that wood. It's called Old Smoky, and there's a reason. When those 4 were put into the chamber, for that, an attorney from Oakdale came to work with John McClure on his last will and testament. And the day of the execution, he asked the executioners if John could go last so he could get his paperwork in order, and they said that was fine. But the executioners got together and said, that little guy over there, that Charles guy, the Charles Petrie guy, that little guy, he's jumpity. We're going to have to put him first. Otherwise, he'll never make it. He'll never make it through all 4. Now, that death chamber, that smoky chair, was sitting 10 feet from where these boys' cells were. So they could hear everything that's going on. And they could see everything that was going on. And they could smell everything going on. Charles Petrie was let out like at 6:02 in the evening and electrocuted. And then every 5 minutes after that, they came in sequence. Tom Christmas, I think, was next. Otto Stevens came, and then John McClure. The attorney, I found a report from the attorney for John McClure, who said it was absolutely horrifying in that cell because after Charles Petrie was executed, black smoke would billow from the room and roll down the detention center or the death cells where they were waiting every single time. That's why it was called Old Smoky, because it produced a lot of smoke. And the attorney Burge from Oakdale and Harriman area said he will never, ever be witness to another of those cases again. Just before the execution, though, Lee Christmas tried to get appeal as Charles Petrie's family and John McClure's family, and I guess all of them were trying to get this reduced down to life imprisonment or some, non-death. And they were after Alf Taylor, and Taylor just wouldn't hear it. They were pestering him in the hallways of the courthouse. And finally, he said, "I'm going to go home and I'll make my statement." And he did. And in the book, I gave the complete full account of what he said. But he just basically said, if it's one thing to kill a man, but to kill a man, to tie him up, to gag him, to cut his throat, and leave him to die is the most horrendous thing you could do to a person. But Andrew Crumley survived the tale of murder will out. That was the reason Alf Taylor did not stay the execution, that it was these guys had committed a conspiracy for a crime. And in the commission of that conspiracy, committed another crime, which was murder. That wasn't the original part of the conspiracy. These guys never really did plan to kill anybody, but it was because Charles Petrie identified George Lewis and George Lewis identified Charles Petrie, they realized that had to occur. So the commission of a conspiracy was to rob a bank. And in so doing, another crime was committed, then all 4 of those men were guilty. It's a first for Tennessee. At that time, all 4 defendants refused to take this jury stand, so they did not stay defend themselves. That was the first time that's ever happened. All the other defendants on murder trial in Tennessee have given testimony to save themselves. Some of the attorneys that I've talked to that read what I had said that if they had probably done that, some of them probably could have saved themselves from the electrocution. So they did appeal this to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld the decision of the original findings. So on March 1st, 1922, these men were killed and executed on smoking. So that's the story of this. And subsequent to that, Ray, one thing that I never anticipated was to hear from any family members. Right. And Otto Stevens was the first one. A family member contacted me, and I thought, oh no, Otto Stevens. I thought Otto Stevens, I knew in my mind he was the murderer. I knew that he was the one that did the cutting. Yeah. And I talked to a family member whose mother was a niece of his who sat in the trial during that period of time. And she said that they knew that Otto was a murderer. They knew that he killed that man. So it confirmed to me what they had. However, they didn't know the circumstances. Nobody knew the history of the story. So they thanked me for the book. I was relieved because I thought, oh no, here we go. Didn't hear from anyone else, but guess what? I did hear from George Lewis's family. No. And just a side note here, it's always good to make sure that when you have your family history, use it as your guide, not as your gospel. Because they had the story totally turned. They had George Lewis as being the president of the bank that he was killed in the commission of the crime. Oh. So when they saw the story and I tried to explain to them what had really happened, they were, no, you got it all wrong. Well, I had to send them all the documentation and all the stories, and they didn't want to talk to me after that. And that was the last time I talked to them.
Oh, you changed their history, didn't you?
I changed their history. That's why I always say, use your family history as a guide, not as the gospel. Because once you treat it as the gospel, you're resistant to the truth after that. Yeah. But Andrew Crumley's family did. I found Tim Crumley, his grandson. His wife had contacted me, and this was just maybe a year after the story. She found the story and called me and said, would I come over? It was his birthday, and he's always wondered about this story and Andrew Crumley, who survived. Yeah. But he died in 1964. And so I went over there and told him, and he shared with me that the story has it that Andrew Crumley, after that incident, became somebody that witnessed to every living soul that he came in contact with about, have you made your peace with God, and that type. Pumping gas, he would preach it. Everywhere he went, he would preach it. And of course, at that time in the pit, he had the New Testament in his back. So he's always been a religious man. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yes, I agree. Okay, stop sharing.
Okay.
All right. Anyone have any question that you'd like to ask Mark about that story? Now's your time.
And I would say, Ray, that Ray helped me immensely on this story years ago. He was able to point me to some people that were key. Dennis Eggert, Leo York, Fred Eller. All of these people helped. The reason I found the location, if you see in that church pit, and you'll see it if you get the story, if you're interested. Nobody knew where this church pit was. So it was essential that I had help from other people, and people knew about this as a murder pit. And that's what led us to the location. So without their help, I wouldn't have been possible to locate it. So it was fun.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. Really,
Absolutely.
yeah, appreciate you sharing your story with us. And we're running right up on the end of our time. I have a couple of things that kind of current I want to share with you. And I will start with this. Just yesterday, the Wheat reunion was held at the George Jones Memorial Baptist Church out near East Tennessee Technology Park Heritage Center, or what used to be K25. There were about 85 people there that were inside the old church building and had a really good time there. And I don't have the picture of him, but this man sitting right over here was the one that was the guest speaker. He's the one that had created the marker for the Roberts family there. And Ralph Martin is his name. And then this is a picture of the church where we were. And I had another event happen just a couple of weeks ago. I got to stop now. This is the USS Oak Ridge, which is a ship that's named for Oak Ridge. These are the sailors that were on that ship at some time, and they come back, have for several years now, come back for a reunion in Oak Ridge. And they have given us some items out of the ship that we're going to create a display, and I'll show you those at the next time. So we're out of time. Any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have real quick, let me know. And then we'll see you again next Monday. All right.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. All right.